right, well, I got 4:01 on my watch, so lock the door. We're going to get started here. I am John Grubb. I am a solutions architect at Platform.sh, as you can probably tell from my intro slide up there. Platform.sh is a hosting company, first of all. So I, as a solutions architect, am in charge of, talking to customers when we first get to talking to customers and sort of figure out the solution for them, like how we're best going to host their application. If it's a Drupal application that's fairly simple, then it's usually a fairly straightforward process. If it's a Drupal application with a Node.js front end, there's usually a bit more of a conversation. We host all different kinds of applications. So I'm also in charge of implementing those, enterprise clients when they come on board. And it was during one particularly long onboarding process with a decoupled Drupal project running Drupal 8 on the back end and some sort of server-side rendered node thing on the front end, that I actually came up with the title of this particular project, because they had a lot of dependencies between the front and the back, and it was just arduous, and it wasn't what I expected, it wasn't what they expected, and so I figured, I could get up and talk easily for an hour about all the reasons you shouldn't decouple from Drupal, do a decoupled Drupal setup, and then I remembered this conference was coming up. Anywho, I submitted the topic. That was a couple of months ago, since they ultimately very successfully launched and are now extremely happy customers. So I can only remember about 25 minutes worth of material, but that's what we're going to talk about today. Some of the reasons not to go decoupled. And so I'm sure everybody here could probably fill out this slide for me. Why do developers and teams decide to go decoupled in the first place? Does anybody want to volunteer and see if I got a bullet point on this slide? Yes?
It's the coolest thing ever.
Well, actually, yeah. That is sort of the unspoken. I didn't actually put that one down because I didn't want to seem, coy or anything. That was actually the very first decoupled Drupal site I ever built, was for that, pretty much that very reason, Let's see what the first bullet point I've got written down here. These are all legitimate reasons. You need to serve multiple devices. So Drupal 8 especially comes with all these great, API capabilities that make it a perfect, sort of a back-end as a service that you can configure, and then you can not just serve like a website or a mobile app. You can do iPhone apps, you can do Android apps, you can do all kinds of different stuff and serve to all kinds of different devices, all sorts of different presentations, without having to drive yourself crazy with media queries and just trying to fix one page of HTML to work across everything. You can really actually target the devices you're trying to target with, APIs on the back end. It's a very good reason. Performance. We have another customer who put together a React front end with a Drupal, back end, in which editors edit content and the public only sees the front end, and this thing is screaming fast. I couldn't believe when we finally went live how fast this site actually was. And their server resources, their servers are basically sleeping in the face. This is a brand you've all heard of, and they're on not a significant amount of hardware, and they're just snoozing. We could probably move them down to this, because they've moved a ton of the rendering CPU out into their customers' browsers, and so that's pretty friggin' smart. And the site hums. So also a very good reason to decouple. Developer happiness. This is actually sort of along with it's the coolest thing ever. This is, my very first project where I thought, ooh, maybe I'll try this in Angular and just use an API from Drupal. My boss wanted something that was like a mobile app where he could swipe from article to article. And I spent a couple of days trying to figure out how to do this in a normal Drupal way, and use a touch framework and maybe prefetch some pages on the side so they could load in. Obviously it sounds like a disaster, because it ended up being a disaster. And I decided, actually, well, hey, this is why, there's plenty of people outside the Drupal world, like in Ruby on Rails. This is a totally common thing to just use Rails as an API server, and then we'll build a front end in Angular or whatever it is we're going to build it in. And Angular comes out of the box with a bunch of touch swipey functionality, and it's a very successful project that was very good for my resume, and also a lot of fun, I didn't have to deal with Drupal's theming layer anymore. Hooray! So, in my mind anyway, it was a very good reason. Most realistically, it's probably a combo of all of these things above, right? You need to keep your developers happy. They're going to quit you need to have your sites be fast, or your users are going to quit. And if you've got a requirement for serving a bunch of different devices, like it's a complicated world out there, and trying to fit that all into one set of media queries that's going to make everything happy is just like a good recipe for insanity. So here we kind of get into the meat. By a show of hands, does anyone here run Composer Update on their, say, Drupal 8 project more than like once every 2 weeks? Or do you just kind of let them sit until there's a security update and you need to update one specific package? That's what I do, or did, rather, before I was like, I can't do this anymore, and jumped to a hosting company. So yeah, the follow-up to that is, how often do you spend unbreaking things after you run Composer Update, like on all of your dependencies? I was having a chat with Peter Willan, who's split to some other thing, and he's a core Drupal 8 contributor. He said they run Composer Update on all of their things on the product that he works on now, and they spend anywhere from 1 to 20 hours unsorting the mess after that, just so they can stay current on everything. Because that's part of the beauty of Composer and package managers, is that you can use all this other code that other people have written. And part of the madness of Composer and package managers is that you're using all this code that other people have written. If they write something that conflicts with this thing that depends on it over here, you have a problem. And so this is ultimately a chat about dependencies. Not just Drupal. Well, here, let's get into it. Composer and Drupal, we kind of went over this already. That's a fairly significant dependency. Your project depends on all these other third-party libs to work correctly, and for Composer to, install everything, make sure that the dependency graph is resolved correctly and install all the correct packages, and Composer does that really well, but it doesn't have any idea if these two different libs are going to conflict with each other and your project's ultimately going to explode. NPM, this is getting into the decoupled bit of it. NPM actually has made great strides in the last probably 2 years since the Yarn package manager came along, but prior to that, NPM just shipped with like package.json, which didn't even bother resolving the dependency graph for you. So all of you different developers on the development team could be installing completely, well, not completely, but basically different versions of all your NPM packages when you do it locally, and God only knows what's going to happen when you push it out and try to install those NPM packages up there. Yarn fortunately came along and came up, sort of introduced the concept of a lock file to the NPM world, and NPM fortunately picked that up, and so, NPM actually has come a very long way in the last, 18 months or so. But you're still resolving dependencies and depending on a bunch of code that other people wrote. And if your code is going to depend on their code, Anywho, this is where we kind of, y'all have probably all experienced all of this, so, I'm probably not telling you anything new. But the dependencies between your front end and your back end, if you're actually going to, say, okay, fine, I can deal with this, you're going to go build a decoupled project, well, you have a dependency between now two completely separate applications that you're writing. If you're going to update a field, you're going to add a new field, or you're going to compute how this thing is displayed to your user, or whatever. If there's anything that's going to change on the front end from what your user sees, does that also require a change on the back end? And isn't the part sort of kind of the underlying pitch to your bosses when you're talking about decoupling that you can hire front end people and they can not worry about the back end? I mean, that does make a lot of sense, but it's not entirely true, because what you were displaying is information that was pulled from a back end, and what if you need to do, I don't know, something on the back end that requires a change in the front end? It just requires more teams to communicate. It requires, well, all development requires our development teams to talk to each other, but you're just kind of throwing in an extra layer of an impedance mismatch where you've got the Drupal people and you've got the React people, and hopefully you have a translator in there somewhere. The dependency on your developers. It's wonderful that you can hire just dedicated front-end people and just dedicated Drupal people, but then you have to actually hire, you have to either hire dedicated front-end people. You basically have dependencies on two different teams at this point. You can't just hire I mean, it was hard enough to find Drupal developers in the Drupal 7 days, and now you're dependent on not just Drupal developers, but also finding front-end developers and making them work together successfully. And so this was sort of a, I don't know, this is a term that I didn't obviously come up with. I'm sure you all have read it before. You know, the couple of decoupled sites that I helped build back in my Drupal building days were ultimately distributed monoliths. So the monolithic application is basically the precise opposite of a microservices-based application. A monolith is basically every Drupal site that you've ever built. It has the user auth, it has the rendering, it has forms, it has a database layer. Everything that the application could possibly require is contained in this one code base. That's what I mean by monolith. And so part of the sort of the beauty or the idea of decoupling is that you can start to split this up and sort of kind of ape like a microservices type architecture where you can have a piece over here that provides user authentication, that provides content APIs that maybe the general public doesn't read these content APIs, but they can serve other front ends, as we said in slide 1 or 2. However, if there is this dependency between these two, I mean, there's got to be a dependency between these two, and so you're really not actually simplifying things by pushing things apart. You're kind of just spreading the complexity out a little bit more and making it require basically more sort of knowledge to be able to debug the entire thing. So let's see, what's I talking about with the development process? So yeah, how do you keep the front end and the back end in sync? These are probably, I don't know how many of y'all here have actually undertaken or successfully completed decoupled projects, but these are things that, you probably didn't discover or didn't think of before you started your first one, because you were really just kind of, at least I guess I'll just talk about my experience. The light bulb went on in my head. This would be a great way to solve this, and I didn't really think about too much about what the downsides could be, as far as what if the title field changes, or what if the body field changes, or what if we switch to paragraphs? Like, that was fun. We built this front end thing, and then later on we refactored the normal website, the desktop website, and decided to go paragraphs at that point. And so we basically had to go rebuild all the APIs that were serving our front end thing. And so, fortunately it was a very small team. It was basically like me and one other person, so it was very simple. But if you're working in a big company, that can be, a lot of conversations that can seriously impact velocity of your project. Oh, here's a good one. So, say you're doing a feature branch-based development process where, I'm working on a retheme on this branch, or, I just want to work on a simple little feature. But it has a dependency on a backend thing that also changes. How do you keep, if you're splitting this thing apart into two different projects, how do you keep branches on two different projects now in sync with each other? And then, how do you deploy them? Let's see. Oh yeah, I'll get to that one later. How do you deploy those things ultimately? What if the front end depends on a back end feature change? How do you roll those things out? This was, the successful project that I spoke about at the beginning of this talk. They decided to go with actually both the front end and back end in the same Git repository, which is kind of ironic in a way, philosophically, putting two giant applications into one Git repository. But it totally solved their problem. They were able to just push this Git repo and serve a back end and a front end at the same time. But if you have, like probably most of us have, a repo for your front end app and a repo for your back end app, and you have dependencies between those two, it's going to be fun for you to deploy those things. Especially if there's any kind of significant refactoring going on. So, are you really sure about all this? I can tell you as a sort of a technical employee at a hosting company, it's challenging. We serve a lot of what can be considered simple lamp stack stuff. And most of those are fairly quiet for the most part. And we also serve a growing proportion of distributed applications, whether it's a Drupal backend or a Laravel backend or whatever it is that's creating the API. And those require a lot more time lately because there's more of them, but also because of all these things that we're all just discovering as we move into this new decoupled world. And so I guess really the point of this talk is just to beseech those of you who have not really started down the decoupled path. Just think about all of the things that you're not thinking about right now, which is everything that's in this deck. Basically, the dependencies of all these things upon each other, and try and do your cost-benefit analysis whether or not this new coolest thing ever to go decouple and learn React and whatever it is going to be next year, if it's going to ultimately be not just worth it for your resume and for the developer experience portion of it, but whether or not your company is ultimately going to benefit and the product is going to benefit long term, because really what we're talking about is a long-term sort of thought process behind moving into this new world. And so, sorry, not quite 25 minutes, but just, and if anybody's got any questions about, just my own perspectives from your friendly hosting company about how you might be able to make it easier, or if you're facing a problem, now's the time. But other than that, that's basically what I've put together for this talk. Has anybody got any questions? Yes.
When you're talking about the pain between synchronizing between client and server development,
yeah,
I'm wondering, have you guys used GraphQL yet to which addresses some of those concerns? And if you have, how much did that help, or are there other kinds of pain problems?
So actually, one of the projects that I've worked on is using GraphQL, and tell you the truth, I didn't run into any problems with GraphQL, so that probably speaks well of GraphQL in that regard. The interesting thing about their particular implementation, I don't know if this is, I'm a server person now, at least by trade, and so I don't know if this is just the way GraphQL has to be, or if this was particular to Drupal's implementation of GraphQL, but I realized shortly after they went live that the server was kind of sucking wind, and I went and looked in the logs, and every single request that was coming to the backend was a post request. And so, therefore, not cacheable. It was requiring Drupal to do a whole heck of a lot of work in order to serve these API responses. So that was really kind of my only experience with GraphQL as a member of your friendly hosting company, was that it probably does solve a lot of the problems you're talking about as far as keeping things in sync, but at the same time you pay a performance penalty for that, and so take that calculation into your head.
Basic question, is there anything, like GraphQL is a good example, is there anything that has stood out to you where you've been dealing with, the decoupled world, that you can think of besides in GraphQL, like anything else that you've seen in the logs, or anything that just sticks out in your head that is like, okay, this was sort of difficult to deal with, or something that you could point to, specifically where you would say, okay, this is a pain point that maybe would be good for people to know?
I can tell you another customer who had a really successful implementation. And so they were using Drupal as the editor. They had a server-side rendered React front end that actually spoke to Elasticsearch. And so they had Elasticsearch, which sounds crazy. I don't like moving pieces, just because. But they actually had Elasticsearch in between Drupal and the front end. And it just sort of served as this, in my mind, this amorphous, malleable pool of all of their content. So they were able to, the editors, of course, were able to do their job. the backend was not under heavy load by being hit directly by whatever is on the client side. And actually they have been probably the quietest. They're a very large publication, but they are very quiet once we got everything in place. There's, of course, the more pieces you add, the more pieces you have to keep upgraded as new software versions come out. So we've had to deal with that. But as far as the inner workings and the performance of their site, I thought that was a pretty interesting approach. You kind of, it's not like using a message queue necessarily, but just sort of having this buffer layer in between your front end and your back end. I thought it was a pretty clever approach because you have this, Elasticsearch is really this, like, it's just it's like a NoSQL database, but more, and so rather than using GraphQL, hitting Drupal directly, they sort of use this. They were able to, evolve their front end and the way it would call for the content APIs without necessarily having to change things in Drupal in order to accommodate changes on the front end. And so I thought that was a pretty interesting approach that has worked well for them so far.
Cool. So just kind of abstracting, to a separate service as a layer between
exactly
the front end and the back end.
Exactly.
Drupal in this equation because it's slow. So
yeah, basically. Yeah, I mean, in Elasticsearch is fast. Like, it's very fast. It doesn't take a ton of resources. It takes, at least their implementation, takes up a ton of disk space, but that's because they've got a ton of content in there. By default, it doesn't take up a ton of disk space. It runs on Java, so it does, it takes up a chunk of RAM. But once it's running, like, it doesn't eat your server too much. So I thought that was a pretty cool idea. Stop. Slack. Yes.
This might be hard to quantify, but given all of these risks, I'm curious if you're seeing a lot of sites being hosted where it seems that they really, the benefits do not justify all of this extra work, or if this is just a cautionary tale about planning for these situations.
We've been onboarding more and more decoupled setups. I haven't seen anybody bail yet, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah.
I don't know what, I'm obviously not privy to their internal discussions, and obviously I have my opinion about whether or not it's worth it, to be serving what are ultimately content-based sites. Mm-hmm. But I haven't seen anybody bail out yet. So apparently their internal business calculations are that it's, for all the reasons above.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. I think, yeah. Has anybody else got one? Because that was actually just like perfect 25 minutes. Cool. Thank you all very much.